So my name is John Paul Farmer. I am the Director of Technology and Civic Innovation at Microsoft, and I'm excited to be your moderator today. We've got an incredible panel who I'm going to introduce you to momentarily. But first, I just wanted to recap that this is a conversation about citizen and government collaboration. And what's really interesting about this is that in the 21st century, policies only work if the technology works. That's something that we've learned again and again. Maybe the best example is healthcare.gov. And we're really in a moment that President Obama has called an all-hands-on-deck moment, where we need everyone. We need everyone to step up, because most of our smartest people don't work in government. They work in all kinds of other capacities. We need to figure out how we can include them in this process so that we can get the best possible outcomes. I guess one other thing I'll say before I pass it along to start the conversation is that earlier today, people were talking about New York City's most valuable resource being its data. I don't agree with that. I think it's our people. I think data is incredible, but it only works if we have people who know what to do with it and care enough to do something with it. So you're going to hear today about 3 different projects that are great examples of that. And I'm going to start by passing it along for a quick presentation on those 3 projects. Then I'm going to moderate a conversation with our panelists, and then open it up so that you can get your own questions in and answered. To start, we have from the Department of Homeless Services, we have Kari Auer, who is, I have it written down here, Kari's the Director of Mobile Applications and Acting IT Chief of Staff. It's a long title, that's why I had to read it. But Kari is going to walk us through a presentation on the Hope 2016 project. Take it away.
Thank you. Next slide. So welcome, everyone, to this panel. As John mentioned, I'm going to be talking about... Oh, is it not on? Oh, it's just not close enough. OK. So I'm going to be talking about the annual Hope Count that the Department of Homeless Services does each year. It's an event that's held in the middle of January. You can actually go to the next slide. That's held in the middle of January once a year, and we recruit over 3,000 volunteers to canvass all public spaces in New York City, including subways and parks, to count the number of street homeless that they encounter throughout the night. It's a one-night event. It happens from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. And it's a very meaningful event that the department uses to figure out how to allocate resources and connect with street homeless that we didn't know about in our normal canvassing approach. And this year we piloted, it's a very paper-based operation, and this year we piloted a mobile app and an accompanying web application for admins. So rather than filling out paper surveys, our volunteers had an iOS app that allowed them to enter the surveys digitally. Oh, we have a little technical glitch. So this event, as I mentioned, we are looking to get 3,000 volunteers. It's not something that the department can do on its own, and so we need the collaboration of citizens to do that. I'm going to just show you a little something that we pulled together this year to encourage engagement in groups that we haven't engaged with previously. You can go to the next slide and play. Oh, the previous one, yeah.
Are you enjoying a home right now? Because thousands of others can't. But there's hope, and you can help. Join other volunteers to help identify chronically homeless individuals. We'll offer resources to help them move to a more stable, safe environment. Bring a friend. Honestly, what's your friend doing that's so important? We can make a difference together.
So this was the first year that the department really focused on social media and innovative things to get the citizens engaged and sign up. We had more volunteers than ever before. And actually, that was exceptional considering that the Blizzard Jonas had us reschedule the event. So we had to recommit all the locations, recommit all the volunteers for 2 weeks later. We still had a fabulous turnout. And then I just want to talk a little bit about the app that we developed. We developed it in collaboration with a nonprofit, We Shelter. They helped us get mobile developers and a project manager to pull together this iOS app in about 2 weeks. It went really, really well. We're in the process of getting feedback from volunteers who used it for future development for next year, hope 2017, to make an even better app that has even more functionality. And finally, I just wanted to mention that this Hope 2016 was really innovative in terms of the things that we were able to do this year compared to the previous year. And given longer timeline and some more resources and greater collaboration with the folks that were involved in the pilot project this year with the iOS app, I think 2017 is going to be even better.
Awesome. Give it up for Kari and the work being done out of the Department of Homeland Services, Homeland Services. So next up, we are going to hear from Noelle Francois. Noelle is the Executive Director of HeatSeek. Who here has heard of HeatSeek already? Good chunk of the room. So you've got to win over the other half. Full disclosure, I'm very happy to be on the board of HeatSeek and have known about them and been as helpful as I could since the very beginning. So now you're going to have a chance to hear from Noelle about what they do and where things stand.
Great. Hi, everyone. As John said, I'm the Executive Director of HeatSeek, and as our name implies, we are concerned with helping tenants in the wintertime when their landlords break the law by not providing adequate heat in their apartments. You may or may not know, but there is actually a law that requires landlords to heat residential apartments to 68 degrees during the day and 55 degrees at night during the wintertime. But unfortunately, that law is not always enforced, and it's very difficult to enforce. So how many people in the audience have ever lived in an apartment where their heat went out? Yeah, it's a big problem. When we looked into the 311 data around heat complaints last year, there were 230,000 heat complaints that came in during the winter months, and it's the #1 complaint to 311 during the winter months. So it's not an insignificant problem, but unfortunately, it can be very difficult, one, to prove that your heat is out, and two, to get it resolved. If you call 311 to tell them that you don't have heat, they will immediately turn around and call your landlord and let them know that someone just submitted a complaint, which is great if your landlord just doesn't know that the boiler is broken, and now he can come by and fix it. But if your landlord is maybe doesn't have the best intentions and he's intentionally lowering the heat, maybe to save money, maybe because you're a low-income tenant and he's trying to evict you, if he has reasons why he doesn't want to heat the building, it's actually really difficult to catch him, because now he has the information of exactly when the HPD inspector is going to come out and inspect the building. So if you call 311, they send an HPD inspector sometime within 3 days. So all he has to do in order to game the system is pump the heat back up for 3 days, which makes it really difficult to get your problem resolved, which means tenants are often fighting to get their heat turned back on for weeks, months, years. We've been in one building for 3 winters now, and they're still struggling to get their heat turned back on. So as a team of Civic hackers, we decided to do something about that. So we built very simple, low-cost, web-connected temperature sensors, because what we realized is that when no one really knows what the temperature is inside the building, if you're just waiting for an HPD inspector to show up for 20 minutes, hope that the tenant is home to let them in, hope that the landlord hasn't bumped up the heat for the time that they might come inspect, when we look at heat complaints versus heating violations actually lodged by HPD, it's like an 8 to 10% conversion rate. It's really difficult to actually get an HPD violation for a number of reasons. I don't by any means want to suggest that HPD is not trying very hard to enforce this heating code, but it's really hard when it takes a lot of coordination between the tenant being home, the landlord not having malicious ideas about turning down the heat, all of that. So we created these temperature sensors, and they just monitor the temperature in the apartment every hour for weeks or months or even the entire heat season if that's what you need. So they monitor the temperature, and then you can log in to our website. So every tenant who has one of these sensors can log into our website and review their temperature data. And importantly, the community organizer that's working with them or the lawyer that's working with them can also log in and view that temperature data. And then everyone who has access to that site can download a heat log that tells them exactly what the indoor, the outdoor temperature was, the time of day, and whether or not the building was in violation of New York City's housing code. And you can download this as a PDF and either show it to your landlord, or if it comes to it, you can take it to housing court with you. And you now have the objective data that you need to be able to get your heat restored. So we built these temperature sensors, and then we said, well, how do we make sure that we're getting them into buildings where the tenants really need help? Because it's not just that their landlord or their boiler has broken, which is usually like a one-time event, and then your problem is solved. How do we get them into buildings where people are really having like chronic heating issues? So we took the 311 complaint data from Open Data, or from the city's Open Data site, and we mapped where the heat complaints were coming from. And when we did that, we saw, the darkest blue is the most heat complaints. You can see it's sort of in the Bed-Stuy, Flatbush-ish area, and up into Bushwick, sort of northern Manhattan and South Bronx. And so once we saw that, then we said, great, let's find the community organizations that are already doing tenant organizing around housing issues to try to help tenants get these problems resolved, but they're doing it in a really low-tech way. Let's go partner with them. They're going to have a much better idea of which buildings we should be in order to really have an impact and help the people who need it the most. So that's what we did. We're running a pilot program this winter. We're in 50 buildings throughout the city. And one of our big goals for our pilot program this winter is to get our data admitted in housing court. Because we feel like if we can get it admitted as evidence, if judges accept it, they know what it is, they see it as reliable and objective, if we can set that precedent this year, then next year anyone can show up with heat-seek data and expect to be more successful in housing court. I don't know if you guys know a lot about housing court, but most tenants, I think 90% of tenants who go to housing court go without a lawyer, whereas 90% of landlords go with a lawyer. So it's a really unbalanced playing field, and we're hoping to help change that. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Noelle. Thanks to HeatSeek for the awesome work that it's doing. And one of the other reasons that I'm thanking everyone after they talk is so that Jolly from the Internet Society of New York has time to run from one place to the other and change out the cameras and the slides. So next up, we are going to hear from the Trees Count team, which is a very cool collaboration between Jackie Liu, who's the Director of Data Analytics in the New York City Parks Department, and Liz Berry, who's the co-founder of TreeKit. So please take it away, Jackie.
Oh yes, sorry. I'm just gonna hoard the clicker.
It's okay. Hi, thanks. So thanks for the intro, John. So I'm excited to be here with Liz to talk about our collaboration to help realize a project to crowdsource a map of every street tree in New York City. So last year, Parks embarked on the third decadal street tree census. We have done this in both 95 and 2005, working with volunteers to inventory street trees across the 5 boroughs. And 2015 was no different in that right here in New York, we launched what was probably the largest volunteer tree mapping project in the world. So, so where's the collaboration part, right, with TreeKit? So one thing to know is that even though the prior censuses created these great data sets that helped parks improve our management of a public asset, the urban forest, the efforts really in the way we collected the data missed the really simple goal of being able to use that data as a map and to stand on a street and confidently identify that the tree you're standing under is the tree that's on the piece of paper or the tablet in front of you. And that was because the data was collected by address. And so if you're familiar with the process of geocoding, you'll notice the sort of data errors that would be introduced through that process. And so you'll notice in the kind of top row graphic how the tree points are everywhere except where the street trees actually are, which is on the sidewalk. And so it was through our collaboration with TreeKit that in 2015, we were finally able to, together with our volunteers, collect better data. And I'm going to turn it over to Liz to talk about that.
Great, thanks. A conceptual strength of this project is that both the city government and the Parks Department needed this data, but also people living in these neighborhoods needed this data. So we can go back almost 10 years to look at partnerships initially built by Philip Silva, who's not here today, but his first experiences mapping trees were with the Parks Department, studying the mortality rate of street trees using Palm Pilots in 2007. And then in 2008, he moved to the Civic sector with Sustainable South Bronx, where their technology was marble notebooks and hand-drawn pencil maps. When I came in as a technologist, it was to partner with someone with this deep domain expertise. And together over the next few years, the story of TreeKit, before we were able, and while we were moving towards building a partnership with the city, was that we did small prototype projects with individual, very local, small environmental stewardship organizations, block associations. We were going small grant to small grant, gradually improving our technology. We got clipboards. We printed spreadsheets. We had a Web 1.0 HTML form that sent some numbers out to a Linode box that ran a teeny tiny script and spit back shapefiles. Eventually, we moved on to a CartoDB backend, and that's when you really, this is years later after Phil and I had been taking, tax deductions as business expenses, all the shoes we wore out from literally pounding the pavement. And so, yeah, this had been, before I hand it back to Jackie, I just say this method had been field tested for 4 years with 12,000 trees and tree beds having already been mapped, and hundreds of people across a diverse swath of New York, from Highbridge in the Bronx to Western Queens to East Harlem to the Gowanus watershed, having tried and improved this method. And then we began to really work together.
So, it was amazing to be able to kind of work with Liz and Phil through these many iterations of prototype. I remember what I think fondly referred to as TreeKit Classic, which is the clipboard version, to the CartoDB backend, front end on GitHub pages. That was the Highbridge pilot. But really, why did this collaboration work? So I think what Liz and Phil built met a very real need. We already had the Parks Department already had a history of volunteer-driven efforts that this tool could be directly applied to. So I think if we didn't have that really strong use case, it would have been hard to push through all the different kind of bureaucratic and administrative pain points that on the government's part required kind of working with a startup, and I think we felt that on both sides. And then I think where we were able to add value was to also help, provide opportunities for TreeKit to test their tool, their design and methods as part of actual programs, actual greening programs. And then, of course, the joint grant funding. We did a lot of that as well because it was not, working with a startup was not something that, was easy to just add as a line item in our regular budget to advance. So when it comes down to kind of what was the result of the collaboration, I think this is what we accomplished. While we didn't meet our kind of original goal of mapping the entire city in 1 year, which was kind of a stretch because in all prior years it took us 2 years, we did finish 80% of the city. We did complete the Bronx, Manhattan, and Staten Island, mapped more than 500,000 trees, engaged more than 2,600 volunteers. And so really, this Trees Count is a collaborative project in that we engaged with volunteers to create what is going to be open data, and then I hope all of you will be able to take and use to create the next round of feedback loops between citizen and government. But what I think Liz and I really wanted to communicate is how that collaboration was itself a product of a citizen government collaboration, and that's what we wanted to share. So there you go.
Super. Thank you to Trees Count, the team, the collaboration between the Parks Department and TreeKit. So now we can get into some Q&A. I'll ask a few questions and then open it up. So the first one is going to be provocative. The question is, why? Isn't this what governments are supposed to do? Why is it that we're looking for collaborations outside of government?
As a government agency, I can answer the why for us. It's the Hope Count is a very important integral piece of our business operations to really understand the street homeless population, and we do have outreach teams that are canvassing the city daily, engaging with them. But really, a massive citywide effort to canvass all public spaces in New York City cannot be done with just our employees. We really need to connect with citizens, engage them, and get them to volunteer and help us in something that really does make a difference in an individual's life.
And I guess that kind of leaves it to me to also, and yeah, I mean, similarly to DHS, this is the data that the Parks Department just didn't have at a citywide scale since 2005. It was hard for us to operationalize the data because of the kind of spatial data quality that the prior efforts resulted in. And I'd say that for Trees Count, we really had two goals, and we weren't really willing to give up on either of them. One was to have amazing high quality data being collected in a citywide census so that we can make real management decisions. I mean, sure, through operations, eventually we would have mapped the entire city, but that probably would have taken about a decade at kind of like, if you look at the number of trees that we actually touch on an annual basis, it would have taken us 10 years to collect all of that data. And then the other major goal was to engage with people like Liz and all the community groups and all the volunteers that care about trees in the first place, and to engage with them and to start creating a dialogue. So I think it's really, we literally couldn't have done it ourselves is the short takeaway.
I also think that there are some things that are better left to private citizens. So like, for example, HPD has this staff that is tasked with enforcing the housing code, but if they were going to try to do what we had done, like they would have had to hire a hardware engineer and a bunch of data scientists, and it doesn't necessarily seem to make sense that they would have, it would cause every single government agency to like grow its staff if they wanted to do all of these things that just curious citizens are happening to do in their free time or their spare time. City agencies don't have unlimited budgets, so.
Super. So carrying on in this conversation. Oh,
I've got one.
Yeah,
just
please.
to say. So I think we have a general, like, a better together mentality. And then I think we have the sort of the traditional role of the civic sector. And again, civic tech is under the civic umbrella, right? We were civic before we were civic tech, which is an accountability role, which I see your project as in, really strongly. And then, I mean, there might have been some way that you can see community groups who are out there trying to take a higher level of care of the trees in their neighborhood because they cared about that so much than would have been what equitably could have been provided by a government service across the whole city. In fairness, some neighborhoods wanted more or were facing problems that meant that they needed to up their game in other ways.
That's a great point. So it's not just about the service, it's also about accountability and also buy-in from the citizenry. So sticking with this conversation around stakeholders, the different kinds of stakeholders, who do you view as your users?
I can start. This is actually something that we've thought a lot about. We take as our first user the tenants that we actually work with. However, we had to design a product that didn't assume that the tenants that we were working with had access to the internet or any kind of hardware knowledge, right? Like you shouldn't have to have hardware knowledge in order to be able to benefit from the product. So we made a lot of design choices around this should be a tool that is very plug and play, and then tenants, so you plug in the hardware and it just sits there, and then tenants can log into their account and view their data if they want to. And maybe they're not doing it every day, maybe they're doing it when they go to the library to use the internet. But so what we also did is we opened it up to their community organizers and their lawyers. So community organizers or the lawyer on the case also has access to that tenant's data and can view and print heat logs for use in housing court. So we struggle a little bit with thinking about who our core user is, because it really is kind of the tenant, and the tenant should totally have access to their data. It's theirs, they should have it. But we want that other support from their community organizer or their lawyer if they don't have any interest in looking at the data, or they're not able to look at it as frequently as they'd like to.
I can jump in and say that our user is the Hope volunteer, and we definitely had a lot of internal conversations about what that looked at, and we looked at data from volunteer registration in past years to really identify that user and see who was supporting, who was volunteering, and then more importantly maybe who wasn't, and trying to think through new ways to engage those folks and get them involved. And that's sort of what drove communications through community boards, through elected officials, through social media, our collaboration with Ben Stiller to create a short video for us.
So to follow up on that question, Kari, what did you then do in terms of your user experience or user interface, since you knew exactly who your user was? It was the Hope volunteer. What did you do? What did you think about in terms of how to design for that particular audience?
In terms of the design of the app that we built, we looked at sort of the user base and the time that we had, which was actually only about 2.5 weeks to turn out this mobile application, which is a little ridiculous.
That's impressive for anybody, especially for a government agency. I mean, that's
yeah.
Wow.
It was a tremendous effort, and we realized we couldn't do it all, so we wanted to do something that would be meaningful, and so we decided to focus on an iOS app, because that was sort of, we had some iOS developers that we could tap into. We have a UX UI designer on staff at Department of Homeless Services, and so he really is very knowledgeable, and we connected with a lot of existing folks that had volunteered in the past that really know the process in and out, the paper-based process, and really helped us visualize digitizing that process and making it fluid and easy, and not just for someone that knows how to do Hope and who has done it in the past, but for brand new users. And so we used sort of internal focus groups with employees and friends of ours that aren't familiar with the process, and really made sure that it was streamlined.
Right.
Sure. I think imagine the original question that spurred the creation of all these projects and all these human hours going into making these big projects possible. It's a good place to think about is like, who is asking the question? And depending on that, the rest of your project design kind of rolls out. Getting down to a detail, I mean that in many cases, there's a single question being asked by a government agency, and a lot of people are going to be mobilized to answer it. And sometimes that process can be extractive, meaning there's not much in it for the volunteer. And at least in the Tree Kit project, and I believe in all of these projects, because I believe we have some good examples here, we wanted to design the user interface and the user experience to give something to the participant. So the Tree Kit part of the larger Trees Count 2015 process had a very carefully designed educational process. So people came away with, they learned how to identify trees, and that's something they can keep as a skill for themselves moving forward. And maybe, there's also engagement with their local area and other people they meet. And so just when you're thinking about asking a question and designing how data is going to be collected towards it, think about what is really of value to your user, and a kind of a triple bottom line of whatever multiple things you can get as a result of asking this question.
So having worked in both the private sector and the public sector myself, I absolutely understand how hard any project is. And especially when you're working across sectors, when you're working with collaborators, you're simply adding variables, more things that can go wrong. How close did your projects come to dying? What hurdles did you have to get over, and how'd you do it?
I mean, I guess I'll talk to that a little bit. So the collaboration that led up to Trees Count between TreeKit and Parks, I think stopped and started about 5 times. Like probably, like there was the initial, Liz and Phil were like, hey, we have this amazing thing and we can really improve on this process. And I can't even remember when that started now. That was so long ago. But then we had like a grant project where we were like, okay, let's try to scale the tool to like a larger neighborhood, which was the Western Queens. And then we realized we had like a real pain point with the paper data collection forms. And we were like, okay, so now we have to kind of put it aside for a little while. And then we went and fundraised and, did a grant application to develop a mobile prototype. So I'd say we like for the parks end, it kind of puttered. I think there was at least 3 or 4 or 5 like restarts before we got to the point where we're like, okay, now we're ready to really go and push this collaboration forward into realizing this citywide project.
Jackie, how long was the project? Went from start to launch. How long did that take to get it ready?
When did?
But when did you start working on it, though? When did you start actually making progress?
Well, when did
and
TreeKit
decide you were gonna
start,
do
I
it?
guess, the first time? I'd say it was like almost like 2011, 2010.
2011. I mean,
Yeah.
Phil and I first connected in 2009, and there was some really I'm not
early
even gonna-
prototype.
I mean, there was like AutoCAD involved at some point. Anyway, forget about that.
This overnight success was not an overnight success.
It was definitely not an
It took some
overnight
time.
success.
No, have some other jobs.
The tech innovation itself was iterative, and then there was multiple trials where we're like, okay, this didn't work, this created, and I think from the beginning the innovation was like, here's this great volunteer-centric, easy-to-use tool that generated great data. Like that was always there. I'd say that innovation was there in the very early stages. The part that was hard was figuring out how to actually then scale and operationalize it to be able to, actually be a program that the Parks Department could then roll out across the 5 boroughs. Took a lot of time. So it was more partnership building than tech innovation, and I feel like sometimes at the end of the day.
Did you help the TreeKit guys with that, figuring out how to operationalize it and everything? That was part of your partnership?
Yeah. I mean, not initially. Initially, it was really and I'll let Liz and Phil, it was their effort, it was their passion project. But then when they had something that was working, then we were like, okay, we had an opportunity to do a community greening project in Western Queens, and we're like, okay, let's plug TreeKit into this effort. That was when they wore out the sneakers. But then that was when we also realized we're like, okay, if we're going to try to do half of Queens, collecting all of the data on paper and then doing the data entry into the, I don't know if you want to talk about, okay. That kind of revealed the next pain point for thinking about a 5 borough effort. And then so we then applied for another grant that led to the GitHub Pages CartoDB version. And then that ultimately was what became the prototype that we rolled out, and that I guess John what helped us map a bit too last summer. So yeah, it was a lot.
Yeah, but it's phenomenal that your agency was helping with all of that, helping TreeKit through the process, right?
Yeah, it was really hard. We definitely ran up into our own walls where how do we get money to TreeKit was a question that came up multiple times, and we had to kind of figure out how to solve. And then it was I don't know.
That's an interesting point, though. There are cases where the agency is driving this collaboration with the outside groups, the citizenry, the people. And other cases where sometimes it's inward bound, right? It's the people on the outside trying to create the change and having to convince and pull the agency in that direction.
There was definitely that.
I wanted to just emphasize that we had, at this point, it's been a decade, but, they were multi-year long collegial relationships. Me coming in, I was more on the tech side, but I was brought in by people who already had been working in that domain. And so I can recommend that as a path. Well, as you hear our presentation, maybe you're saying there's really not much to be recommended about this path. But let me recommend that partnering with existing civic institutions and with people with a deep domain knowledge in wherever you're trying to insert a little, speed and efficiency and modernization and broad distribution, all the wonderful things that tech does and more. Really forge those partnerships, because there are no end of actually inappropriate and potentially damaging ideas coming out of technologists who haven't spent the time to get grounded in longer political processes.
I think that's a really good point. And it's very heartening for me to hear that you guys have been doing this for a decade now. We're very much in the initial stages of having that cordial relationship with HPD, but they haven't come and said yes, we want to fund you and do all of these things with you. Perhaps we will get there soon.
Perhaps before 2024.
Yes. Hopefully. Yes, or if it gets to 2024, we'll abandon New York. We'll go somewhere else, somewhere who does want HeatSeek. But hopefully it won't come to that. But yeah, I think I wanted to say something to your point of just relationship building. I think it is a process that takes some time. And if you're thinking about it from the tech startup perspective of let's just come in and disrupt this whole system and kind of bulldoze over whatever is currently there and exists and do our own thing, that's not necessarily a good strategy for trying to make change in some of these really kind of entrenched government processes. And so that was something that we were really aware of when we got started, was trying to make sure that we were really adding value to the work that HPD was already doing and adding value to the work that the community organizers we work with were already doing. In terms of how close we've been to dying, that I can't answer that question yet, because I can't say we've overcome any possible I think it's always there's always that fear, but that's what gets you up in the morning.
I think from the DHS side, our CIO, I'm in IT, and our CIO, his first day was Hope 2015. He was a volunteer, and he showed up at his training site in Queens and was like, "What is with all the paper? You got to be kidding me. There's a better way to do this. We will have an app next year." And that was in February of 2015, and it took until a kickoff meeting January 4th, 2016 to officially move forward with building the mobile application that we were going to be using on January 25th. So we had 21 days from kickoff to build it. So there was lots of obstacles that we had to overcome, resources, budgets. It's not an easy process, but if you stick to it and get the right people together in a room to work it out and really understand the process, and you can be creative. But yeah, it was a long process that he drove for many, many months.
Great points. Well, obviously it's never easy. Doing something meaningful takes hard work and isn't a sure thing. So let's just open it up to questions now. We've got a few minutes left. Let's see what we've got. I see in the back. Yes. Actually, let's wait to get the mic so we can hear it on the live stream as well.
Hi, I'm really kind of curious about the HeatSeek experience, because you mentioned people can do these things now, and you're providing them a lot of services to do that. I'm kind of interested to what you've seen them actually do. So, have you been able to kind of alter some of the practice, or how have you seen them integrate this data into it, into what they've already been doing already, and what do you hope to see in the future as far as like moving the needle forward, giving them the data they need and everything else?
Are you talking specifically about HPD or about the community organizers and lawyers too?
All of that, because I mean, you're providing such a service to them. You see them as your users. You mentioned in your you can do this. Obviously, there's a lot of creativity, but like you said, you're data scientists and engineers. I mean, so how are you kind of seeing that move, and what are you doing to adapt to it?
Yeah. So I guess community organizers will go into a building and chat with the folks in the building to find out what their issues are. And then if heat is an issue, they will ask tenants to call 311 as much as possible to report it, but also to keep a handwritten temperature log that has what ours has on it, the indoor temperature, the outdoor temperature, the time of day, and whether it's below the limit. So they were already filling these things out by hand. We sort of just automated that process. And then lawyers were coming to us and saying, this is a huge tool because our tenants often show up with their handwritten logs and the landlord's lawyer just immediately gets it thrown out. Like, how do we know you didn't just make all this up? Or where did you buy your thermometer? Or, if you are not used to being cross-examined during a case, you might not necessarily know or be comfortable answering all of those questions. And so it's really easy, especially if you don't have a lot of experience with the justice system, it's easy to get that information thrown out. So we wanted to provide hard, objective data that wouldn't get thrown out, so that lawyers would have a much easier time saying, look, this is what the data says. It wasn't written by hand. It was collected by tested sensor, and this is what the temperature was. But in terms, are you asking more about design choices that we had to make?
No, I mean, so my experience with city government is, a lot of times people come up in lanes in the road, they've done what's been done, what they were trained to do, or whatever else. And so you're introducing kind of a fundamentally, not say fundamental, but definitely a different data source to them to do their job, which they probably love and want to do, but they're already task saturated with data they already have. And so how have you seen, there's obviously lots of possibilities with the data, but what have you actually seen them be able to do now that they weren't able to do before? How have you adapted to their workflow and their work process?
So with HPD, we're still really exploring that. They have access to our data on the back end, and our hope is that they will be able to see patterns in the data, or if they don't have a data scientist, we can help them identify patterns in the data. So for example, if a landlord is turning off the heat from midnight to 6 a.m. every evening, now you know when to send an inspector, so the inspector shows up and can actually catch the violation, versus if you were sending them at 8 in the morning, they're not going to catch it because it's not in violation anymore. So our hope is that our data will be able to allow them to more efficiently or effectively deploy their inspectors at times when they're more likely to catch violations. So when we're looking at that conversion rate from complaints to violations, we're hoping to see that number go up.
Let's take a couple more quick questions. We are actually at time right now, but anyone who knows me and has worked with me knows I just take that as a light suggestion. So we're going to keep going for a few more minutes, and then we're going to move on to the final keynote.
So for HeatSeek, you said that you had a tenant you've been working with for something like 3 years. What happened there that your data wasn't able to solve their problem?
So the first year that we worked with this tenant, we installed our sensors, I think in April, because we had only started building a prototype in March. So we just hadn't been around long enough to catch them before heat season really kind of tapered off. The following year, we collected tons of data that was showing that the building was in violation. And part of this is that it's sometimes unclear what tenants do with the data. I know they had a lawyer at the Urban Justice Center. I know they filed something. At some point, it was now too late in the year, and they didn't really care anymore because all the judge was going to do is tell the landlord to turn the heat back on, and it was July. So they were why are we even doing this anymore? This year, they've got our data again. I think they're working with a lawyer at the Urban Justice Center. But I think this kind of speaks to the larger issue of we are a tool to help solve one problem, which is data collection. Housing court is like a whole other beast, and it works very slowly. It's like we have tenants all the time, so we have 9 cases in court at some stage of housing court right now, and just every time they're getting adjourned until the following month, which like blows my mind because it's these people in apartments that are like 45 degrees inside their apartment, and it's just like, all right, see you next month. Have another month of it being 45 degrees in your apartment. But it's really complicated. We're still learning a lot about the housing court process and how we can best support tenants. And right now, we're just trying to help get them to lawyers who know way more about it than we do.
So any more burning questions in the room? If not, we're getting the bell rung. So one final question from me is, what have you learned in this process? What's the one secret insight that you've gotten out of all this work that you want to share with the room today before we wrap?
If you think you can come in with like your cool, sweet tech toy and like bulldoze all of the work that everyone around you has already been doing, you may not be as successful as you might think. Our philosophy has always been, and I think I said this during our phone call, but stand on the backs of giants. There are a lot of people that came before us who are doing incredible work, and if you can be a value add to the work that they're already doing, you're pushing the whole thing so much further than if you come and try to like burn it down and start over.
Yeah, I think I would add and echo that statement of really understanding your user, understanding our business operations, understanding the needs, and going from there, understanding your requirements, and then really building something that makes sense for what you need to accomplish.
Just keep trying.
Yeah.
All good thoughts. Well, thank you so much to Hope, HeatSeek, and Trees Count. Please join me in thanking our panelists.